November 14th, 2022. A team of Israeli and international scientists publishes a paper in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution that sends a quiet but devastating shockwave through the entire field of human evolution. The discovery they are announcing is not a new fossil. It is not a new species. It is a pile of fish teeth, thousands of ancient fish teeth scattered across a waterlogged prehistoric site in northern Israel, heated to precise temperatures, crystallized in specific ways, sitting beside burned flint tools and ancient charcoal in a fire pit that nobody living had ever lit. And those fish teeth, as mundane as that sounds, prove something that scientists had spent decades arguing was impossible. They prove that a population of ancient humans was deliberately, systematically, and skillfully cooking their food 780,000 years ago. Not warming it, not accidentally charring it near a lightning strike, cooking it, controlling fire with enough precision to maintain specific temperatures, low enough to soften fish flesh without destroying the teeth. A skill that every single textbook and every single university on the planet had previously insisted did not exist until hundreds of thousands of years later. But here is the thing about that discovery that almost nobody talks about when they report on it. The fish teeth are not the most disturbing part of the story. The most disturbing part is the question sitting directly underneath them like a trapdoor that the entire scientific establishment has been nervously tiptoeing around for years. Because those fish, cooked with that kind of deliberate controlled precision 750,000 years ago in northern Israel, were cooked by hands that belong to a species we have never definitively identified. A population whose existence at that location, at that date, doing those things, does not fit cleanly into the story of human origins that we have been telling for over a century. And when you pull on that single thread, when you follow it backward and forward through the archaeological record of this one impossibly small strip of land in the Middle East, the entire fabric of the out of Africa theory does not just stretch. It tears open and reveals something far stranger, far messier, and far more unsettling than anything the textbooks prepared you for. Let us start with the site itself, because the location matters enormously and most people have never heard of it. Gesher Benot Yaakov. The name translates from Hebrew as Daughters of Jacob Bridge, and it sits on the banks of the Jordan River in northern Israel, in a region that was once the shores of an ancient body of water called the Hula Paleo Lake. Today, you would drive past it without a second glance. It looks like a muddy, unremarkable stretch of riverbank. But beneath that surface lies one of the most densely informative prehistoric sites ever discovered anywhere on Earth. A place where hominins returned again and again across a span of roughly 100,000 years, leaving behind layer after compacted layer of tools, animal bones, plant remains, and fire pits. More than 20 distinct archaeological layers, each one representing a separate period of occupation, all stacked on top of each other in the same patch of ancient lakeshore. Scientists know the site is 780,000 years old because of a phenomenon called the Matuyama-Brunhes transition. Every few 100,000 years, Earth's magnetic poles flip. North becomes south, south becomes north, and then, slowly, they flip back. Tiny magnetic mineral particles suspended in sediment permanently lock in the magnetic orientation that exists at the moment they are deposited, essentially encoding a geological timestamp directly into the rock layers. The most recent major reversal, the moment the planet's magnetic field last flipped its orientation, occurred precisely 780,000 years ago. And at Gesher Benot Yaakov, that exact reversal is recorded in the sediment layers right below the archaeological deposits. That single geological fact transforms the site's age from an estimate into a near certainty. The fish teeth, the burned flints, the hand axes, the charcoal, all of it is definitively 780,000 years old or older. Not approximately, not roughly, 780,000 years. Now here is where the first trapdoor opens. The hominins living at this site were not just using fire. They were not just cracking rocks into rudimentary tools. Researcher Irit Zohar of Tel Aviv University spent 16 years cataloging fish remains from Gesher Benot Yaakov, and what she found was genuinely astonishing. The site contained massive concentrations of fish teeth from enormous carp-like species, some of them nearly 2 meters long, the kind of giant freshwater fish that would have represented a substantial and nutritious meal. But the bones of those fish were almost entirely absent. Just teeth, no bones. And that specific absence is the proof of cooking, because fish bones dissolve and disintegrate when exposed to sustained moderate heat, temperatures below 500 degrees Celsius. But teeth do not. They survive. So a location full of fish teeth and empty of fish bones is a location where fish were consistently cooked, and cooked with enough precision to maintain temperatures that destroyed bones but preserved enamel. Zohar's team compared those 780,000-year-old fossilized teeth against modern fish teeth heated to known temperatures in controlled laboratory settings, measuring changes at the microscopic crystalline level of the enamel itself. The results were unambiguous. The ancient teeth showed thermal alteration patterns consistent with sustained, controlled, moderate heat. Not wildfire, not accidental combustion, deliberate cooking. And combined with the charcoal fragments found nearby, the only ancient charcoal ever recovered from a site of this age in the entire region, and the clusters of burned flint tools arranged in unmistakably intentional fire pit configurations, the evidence forms three independent, mutually reinforcing lines of proof, pointing toward the same conclusion. This population controlled fire, understood fire, used fire as a tool for food preparation, and did so hundreds of thousands of years before any existing scientific model said that was supposed to be possible. The researchers at Gesher Benot Yaakov also found the remains of plants. Dozens of species of nuts and fruits and tubers indicating a sophisticated, varied, deliberately curated diet. Water chestnuts, wild grapes, olives, acorns, and pistachios cracked with stone tools shaped specifically for that purpose. Professor Nama Goran Inbar of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has spent decades excavating the site, points out that fire was probably used not just for fish, but for plant foods too, particularly tubers and roots, many of which are actually toxic when eaten raw but become nutritious and digestible when cooked. The population living here was not surviving. They were thriving, eating a varied and nutritionally sophisticated diet, using fire as both a cooking technology and likely for warmth, and occupying the same location repeatedly across what may have been dozens of generations. And yet, despite all of this, the site has never produced a single human skull. Not one cranium, not one jaw, not one complete bone that would allow scientists to say with certainty exactly who these people were. The tool types they left behind, large flaked hand axes and cleavers made from basalt, belong to what archaeologists call the Acheulean tradition, a stone tool technology most strongly associated with Homo erectus. But without physical remains, that identification remains an inference. A strong inference, supported by the age of the site and the tool technology and the cognitive sophistication implied by controlled fire and systematic cooking. But still an inference, which means that 780,000 years ago, somewhere in northern Israel, beings intelligent enough to cook fish and crack nuts and control fire well enough to maintain specific temperatures left an extraordinary record of their existence and then vanished from the fossil record without leaving a single bone to tell us who they actually were. That mystery would be unsettling enough on its own, but it is only the opening chapter. Because just a short drive south of Gesher Benot Yaakov, in the Jordan Rift Valley near the Sea of Galilee, sits a site that does have human remains. A site that has been producing those remains since the 1950s, in fragments and pieces so confusing and so inconsistent with prevailing scientific models that for decades researchers genuinely did not know what to make of them. The site is called Ubeidiya, and it is approximately 1.5 million years old, making it, at the time of its initial excavation, the second oldest archaeological site ever found outside of Africa, trailing only the famous Dmanisi site in the Republic of Georgia. For most of its excavated history, Ubeidiya was known primarily for its stone tools and its animal bones, sophisticated Acheulean hand axes made from basalt alongside the remains of extinct hippopotamuses, saber-toothed cats, and species of buffalo so large they no longer exist anywhere on Earth. All of it deposited in the sediments of another ancient lake environment, evidence that the landscape of this region 1.5 million years ago was dramatically different from what it looks like today. Wetter, greener, filled with large mammals and rich in the kind of aquatic and terrestrial resources that could sustain a substantial population of hungry early humans. But human remains themselves were almost impossible to find. Just fragments, scattered scraps. Until researchers led by paleoanthropologist Alon Barash at Bar-Ilan University subjected one of those fragments, a vertebra from the lower back of a hominin that had been sitting in storage since its excavation in 1966, to modern analytical techniques. What they found when they did turned everything sideways. The vertebra was from a child, somewhere between 6 and 12 years old, but even as a child, this individual was dramatically larger than expected. The bone's proportions indicated that had this child reached adulthood, they would have stood over 180 centimeters tall and weighed roughly 100 kilograms. Taller than the average modern adult human, substantially more robust. And here's why that matters so much. The oldest hominin remains ever found outside Africa come from Dmanisi in Georgia, dated to 1.8 million years ago. And the hominins who left those remains were tiny, almost chimpanzee-sized, some of the smallest bodied members of the entire human family tree ever documented. Small enough that some researchers have questioned whether they should even be classified as true Homo erectus or pushed into a separate, more primitive category. The Dmanisi individuals were so small, so lightly built, so cognitively limited by their tool technology that they represent what looks like a very early, very tentative first attempt by some hominin lineage to push beyond the African continent. But the Ubaidiyya child, who came 300,000 years later and settled a short geographic distance to the south, was enormous by comparison. Different in size, different in the type of tools they made, different in the ecological niche they occupied. Barash put it directly in his published findings. The difference in body size and bone structure between the Dmanisi individuals and the Ubaidiyya individual constitutes, quote, unambiguous evidence of at least two distinct dispersal waves out of Africa, two separate populations, two separate species, or at minimum two radically different populations of the same species, each leaving Africa at different times, by different routes, adapting to different environments, and arriving in the ancient Middle East, looking nothing like each other. The textbook model that scientists had taught for most of the 20th century held that Homo erectus left Africa in a single, relatively clean migratory event, roughly 1.8 million years ago, and spread steadily outward. One species, one departure, one expanding wave. That model is now dead. It has been replaced by something far more complicated and far more interesting. A picture of repeated, staggered departures by multiple distinct hominin populations, each testing the limits of the African continent in its own way, each taking different routes, each producing different outcomes. And the evidence that killed the old model came almost entirely from this one compact region of the Middle East that you could comfortably drive across in a single afternoon. But the story gets considerably stranger once you move forward in time, because the trail of anomalous fossils from this region does not stop with the deep past. It continues right into the period when modern humans are supposedly just arriving on the world stage. In the hills of Upper Galilee, there is a cave known as Mugaret el Zoutieh, or the Cave of the Robbers, though most researchers simply call it the Skull Cave. In 1925, a British archaeologist named Francis Turville Petre, working with funding partly sourced from the Rothschild banking dynasty, excavated a partial skull from this cave. The fossil, which came to be called the Galilee skull, was just a forehead and the upper portion of a face, but it was immediately recognizable as something significant, something old, something that did not fit neatly into any existing category. For decades, researchers classified it as a variant of Neanderthal, largely because the scientific framework of the 1920s and 1930s had no better slot to put it in. But modern analysis has revealed something far more interesting. The Zoutieh skull lacks the heavy, distinctive facial projection that characterizes true Neanderthals. Instead, it more closely resembles a species called Homo heidelbergensis, a lineage considered by many scientists today to be the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. Current dating places the Zoutieh skull somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000 years old, which means that roughly 300,000 years ago, there was a population of pre-Neanderthal, pre-modern humans living in the caves of the Galilee who did not belong to either of the species that textbooks describe as occupying this region at that time. A third party, an intermediate population sitting exactly at the evolutionary junction between the world's two most famous ancient human species. And then comes the discovery that in 2021 genuinely broke the field open in a way that reverberated through every paleoanthropology department on the planet. A limestone quarry outside the central Israeli city of Ramla. Workers from the Nesher cement factory were clearing a new section of the quarry when their equipment broke through the roof of an ancient sinkhole. Inside that sinkhole, buried 12 meters below the surface in compressed sediment layers, they found stone tools, animal bones, and fragments of something that nobody initially wanted to look at too closely because what it turned out to be was something that should not have been there. Professor Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University, one of the leading physical anthropologists in the world, led the analysis. The fossils included a section of a parietal bone from a skull and a nearly complete lower jawbone. They were dated using uranium series dating, electron spin resonance, and thermoluminescence methods applied to the stone tools found in the same sediment layer. All three methods converged on the same answer, between 120,000 and 140,000 years old. And when Hershkovitz's team analyzed those bones in detail, comparing their morphology against every known category of ancient human, the results generated something close to panic in the laboratory. The skull bone was thick, dramatically thicker than the skull bones of either modern humans or Neanderthals, more consistent with the skull architecture of far more archaic, far more primitive hominins from hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But the jaw and the teeth showed clear features associated with Neanderthals. A combination that made no anatomical sense under any existing model of who was living in this region at that point in time. Modern humans had supposedly been moving through the Levant corridor at 120,000 years ago. Neanderthals were expanding south from Europe. Nobody had proposed that a third, radically different population was also present, a population showing features from both groups while clearly belonging to neither. Hershkovitz and his colleagues named it the Nesher-Ramla Homo type. And then they made a proposal so bold that it split the paleoanthropology community almost directly down the middle. They argued that this was not an isolated anomaly. They argued that the Nesher-Ramla population represented a long-surviving Levantine lineage that had existed in this region, largely unrecognized for hundreds of thousands of years, a lineage potentially descended from or related to the Zoutier skull population found in the Galilee 80 years earlier. A lineage that may have also contributed to the puzzling fossils recovered decades earlier at Skull Cave and Taboon Cave on Mount Carmel. In other words, what the scientific community had previously cataloged as a collection of separate, confusing, unrelated fossils scattered across a century of Israeli archaeology were not separate at all. They were fragments of the same population, pieces of a single previously unrecognized human lineage that had been hiding in plain sight inside museum storage drawers for decades, waiting for someone to realize that they all fit together. But Hershkovitz did not stop there. He then proposed something that strikes directly at the genetic ancestry of every non-African person alive on Earth today. He argued that the Nesher-Ramla population had interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans during the long period when all three groups were simultaneously moving through the same Levantine corridor. That this unknown lineage was not a dead end, it was a contributor. That genes from this population flow forward through history into both the Neanderthal genome and the modern human genome. And since we already know from ancient DNA analysis that every non-African living person carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome, a legacy of ancient interbreeding events, some of what we have been calling Neanderthal DNA in your body, may actually trace back through the Neanderthals to this older, stranger, unnamed Levantine population that nobody even knew existed until bulldozers cracked open a sinkhole outside Ramla in 2010. The implications of that are genuinely difficult to fully absorb. It means the human family tree is not a tree. It is not even a bush. It is something closer to an interwoven thicket where separate lineages merge and diverge repeatedly over millions of years, and to where the boundaries between species were never as clean or as permanent as the textbook diagram suggested. Neanderthals were not a separate evolutionary branch that humanity produced in Europe and then replaced with a superior modern version. They were one strand in an ongoing web of interbreeding populations, some of which we know about, and at least one of which we had no idea existed until very recently. Now you might be asking, why Israel specifically? Why does this one narrow strip of land keep producing discoveries that force the entire scientific community to tear up its models and start again? The answer is geography. The Levantine corridor, the land bridge connecting Africa to Eurasia, squeezed between the eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Desert, is the single navigable route that any hominin leaving Africa on foot was forced to use. For the last 2 million years, every species that moved out of Africa and into the wider world had to pass through exactly this narrow bottleneck, or a route running very close to it. That makes the region a perfect natural recording device. Layer after layer of different populations, separated from each other by hundreds of thousands of years, leaving their bones and tools and fire pits stacked in the same river valleys and cave systems. It also helps that the geology is extraordinarily favorable for fossil preservation. The limestone hills of the Galilee and the Judean foothills are riddled with caves that stayed sealed for hundreds of thousands of years, protecting bone from the weathering and scavenging that destroys ancient remains almost everywhere else. Combined with over a century of sustained, methodologically rigorous archaeological excavation by institutions including the Israel Antiquities Authority, Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan University, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and you get exactly the pattern this region has produced. A steady, decades-long drumbeat of discoveries, each one more unsettling than the last, each one pointing in the same direction. The story you were told about human origins was never the whole story. There is one more layer to this that deserves its own moment of attention, because it involves modern humans, anatomically modern people, who would not look out of place walking down a city street today, and it takes the entire narrative and flips it on its head. Because if you thought the discovery of multiple archaic hominin populations in ancient Israel was surprising, the discovery of what happened to early Homo sapiens in the same corridor is something else entirely. Back in the 1930s, excavations at 2 cave systems on the slopes of Mount Carmel, Skull, and Kafze uncovered skeletal remains that were unmistakably modern human, anatomically indistinguishable from people living today. And when those remains were dated using independent methods, the results came back as somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 years old. Fully modern humans living in Israel. Nearly 100,000 years before the textbook said, modern humans successfully left Africa and colonized the rest of the world. For decades, Researchers explain this away as a failed first attempt, an early pioneering population that moved out of Africa too soon, established itself in the Levant, and was then pushed back or absorbed or replaced by the Neanderthal populations that expanded into the region afterward. But the question that discovery leaves hanging in the air is one that gets more uncomfortable the longer you sit with it. If modern humans were already in Israel 120,000 years ago, fully modern in anatomy, sophisticated enough to bury their dead and use complex stone tools, and if the Nesher Ramla population was also present in the same region at the same time, living alongside them, potentially interbreeding with them, and if Neanderthal populations were also moving through the same corridor from the north, then what was actually happening in ancient Israel during that period was not a series of separate, orderly, sequential migrations. It was a collision, a centuries-long, geographically compressed collision between at least 3 distinct human lineages simultaneously occupying the same small strip of land. Then, in 2015, construction work at Manat Cave in Israel's western Galilee accidentally broke through the roof of a sealed cave that had not been open to the outside world for approximately 15,000 years. Inside, researchers found a partial skull dated to around 55,000 years old. This individual, a fully modern human, was living in the Levant at exactly the moment when genetic evidence suggests our species and Neanderthals were interbreeding. The timing of the Manat skull places modern humans and Neanderthals in the same geographic region at almost exactly the moment that Neanderthal DNA was entering the modern human gene pool. For the first time, researchers had physical fossil evidence to match what the genetics had been telling them for years. These two groups met here. They bred here. The consequences of that meeting are still encoded in your DNA today. Step back and look at the full arc of what this one small region has revealed across roughly a century of archaeological work. 1.5 million years ago, a large-bodied hominin child died near the Sea of Galilee, representing a second, entirely distinct wave of migration out of Africa from a completely different population than the tiny, primitive hominins who had reached Georgia 300,000 years earlier. 780,000 years ago, an unidentified population sat beside an ancient lake in northern Israel, cooking fish with controlled fire and cracking nuts with stone tools, leaving behind evidence of cognitive sophistication that should not have existed that early, and no skeletal remains whatsoever to explain who they were. 300,000 years ago, a population showing features of Homo heidelbergensis occupied caves in the Galilee, representing an intermediate lineage between archaic hominins and both Neanderthals and modern humans. Between 420,000 and 120,000 years ago, the Nesher Ramla population lived across the Levant, invisible to science until 2021, interbreeding with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, and contributing genetic material that flows forward into populations alive today. And between 120,000 and 55,000 years ago, modern humans occupied Israeli cave systems, while Neanderthals and the remnants of the Nesher Ramla lineage were also present, creating a 3-way collision of human types that produced the genetic legacy every non-African person carries in their body. This is not the out-of-Africa theory being slightly revised. This is the out-of-Africa theory being recognized for what it always was, a useful simplification that captured one true and central insight, that humanity originated in Africa while completely missing the complexity of what actually happened next. The real story was never a single confident march outward from one point of origin. It was a series of departures and dead ends and overlaps and minglings and replacements, playing out over 2 million years in one narrow corridor of land, generating the tangled, multiply-authored genome that modern humans carry today. The scientist who perhaps said it most directly was Dr. Rachel Sarig of Tel Aviv University, one of the lead researchers on the Nesher Ramla discovery, who described the ancient Levant as a place where Africa, Europe, and Asia met, and where different human populations exchanged both genes and culture. That is a polite way of saying that the border between modern humans and their ancient relatives was never a wall. It was always a membrane, permeable, two-way, constantly being crossed. And the proof of that has been sitting in limestone caves and under muddy riverbeds in northern Israel for hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for archaeologists with the right tools to find it. There is still a skull missing from that ancient lake bed at Gesher Benot Yaakov. Somewhere beneath the waterlogged sediment of the Jordan River, the cranium of whoever cooked those fish 780,000 years ago may still be perfectly preserved, locked in the same oxygen-poor, bacteria-free environment that kept the fish teeth intact across 750,000 years. When it is eventually found, it will either confirm what researchers already strongly suspect, that it belonged to Homo erectus, or it will open yet another trapdoor beneath everything we thought we understood about who was living in this part of the world and when they got there. Given this region's track record, the smart money is probably on the trapdoor, because every single time scientists thought they had the out-of-Africa timeline pinned down, some unremarkable patch of Israeli soil gave up one more bone. And every single time, that bone turned out to be exactly the wrong size, exactly the wrong age, exactly the wrong species to fit the model that everyone had agreed on. The model keeps changing. The bones keep coming. And somewhere beneath the hills of Galilee, the next rewrite of human history is already waiting.